A church is preparing for Lent and decides it's going to do something dramatic in its urban setting. There's lots of people passing the church every day, and so they put a big sign up that says, "If you're tired of sin, then come inside and rest a while." And somebody took a big black marker and wrote at the bottom, "And if you're not, call 845-443-3516. Now, as Episcopalians, we are very squeamish talking about sin and evil and the devil. We just don't like doing that. And I sense it's part of our own recovery of being spiritually abused by people who were obsessed by sin and had a particular way of controlling us to do something we may have needed to stop doing, but the messenger often got in the way. And maybe that was more destructive than the behavior itself. But what I want us to do today, because of the readings, is to think about where our concept of sin actually came from. Where did we first get a sense of sin in the world or in ourselves? And how has that shaped our ethics and our morality? And the readings today invite us to reflect on these early formative experiences. I talked last week about Epiphany the readings were all about who is this man Jesus. The readings in Lent are all about who are we, and who are we as a community that follow Jesus. And so we look at beginnings today, just like the story in Genesis invites us to look at beginnings. And the writers of Genesis, they're not really concerned about sin. This is kind of a later interpretation, but they're concerned about deep questions like, why do people and things die? Why are we caught in conflict within ourselves and within our families and within our communities? What's the cause of this negative force? And so the Genesis story is a theory of kind of beginning to answer those deeper questions. That's what the author of Genesis, or the authors of Genesis, are trying to embrace. And so many of us reject these kind of ancient thoughts. Genesis is not a particularly popular book to read these days. And if I was talking to a teenager trying to kind of modernize the questions that they were asking themselves, I would say to a teenager, well, why is it that a computer virus exists? What's the point of a virus that is doing kind of secret destructive work to your hard drive or to your network? Or why is bullying in school something that we have to address? What is it about our relationships that bullying is such a phenomenon? So I would try and help the teenager think about what the authors of Genesis were also trying to do. And I reflected a couple of weeks ago, I told you the story of my first experience of God. It was a positive experience. It was light coming through our parish stained glass window. I was about 5. I was bathed in color and light. It was wonderful. It was a warm, kind of positive feeling. And around the same time, there was a woman who lived on our street, and her job, she saw her vocation, to collect the children of the street and to teach them about Jesus. And she would have kind of informal Sunday school in her home. And an image that she painted has stuck with me all these years, and it was about sin. And she said, your soul is like, some of us remember what blotting paper, some of us don't know what blotting paper is, but it's absorbent white paper that when you wrote with wet ink, you blotted the ink so it didn't smudge. And in those days, we filled pens from inkwells. You squeezed, if you remember, filling a fountain pen. So her image of Sin was dropping a fountain pen full of black ink, dripping it onto a white piece of blotting paper, and your soul got blacker and blacker and blacker. A very powerful image for a 5-year-old. And I think spiritually it was abuse, actually. It was very damaging to teach that as to children about their relationship to themselves and to God. And no wonder so many people grow up rejecting anything to do with God or religion and try and find a kind of moral and ethical way to live without the trappings of theology and religious laws and practices for good reasons. And so the interpretation of text, and Genesis has been so misunderstood and so misused. Often, the idea that original sin is only a doctrine that was agreed by the church about the 4th or 5th century. Before that, the belief in the church was that you were born morally neutral and that you could go either way. So the whole idea of original sin is a kind of later development and was not necessarily part of the early Jewish interpretation of Genesis. And we could also trace sexism, the idea that woman is the cause of humanity's fall. And the great cop-out for Adam is, well, Lord, she made me do it. It wasn't my fault. And a way in which, again, the misinterpretation of Genesis, or if you're a scientist, the whole idea that I don't believe that Genesis is set up against a kind of evolution, that we can't possibly believe in evolution and science because Genesis says creation is made in 6 days. And so we throw out the baby with the bathwater, when in fact there's enormous wisdom in Genesis that is passed on to us. And if I was going to look at what the writers of Genesis were trying to do, is they were looking at why death, why conflict, why this disease within us, where did that start? Where did that come from? And the story begins that we are all part of God, and God is alone. God is not like some of the pagan deities where he has a consort, and that we are the fruit of that relationship. In the Jewish tradition, God is alone, and God wants to be in relationship with his creation. And so the first chapter of Genesis is this idyllic, we are created in the image of God, male and female, and that the reproductive, regenerative, creative part of us is still that fingerprint of that first chapter in Genesis of paradise. And we are given dominion over the whole earth. And everything is good. Everything is good. But something happens between the first chapter of Genesis and the chapter that we read today, the second chapter. And it's a very different story. All of a sudden, instead of having the freedom of being in the whole earth, we are now confined to a walled garden. And there are restrictions. Don't eat of that tree. And something has happened. We're not quite sure what. Some biblical scholars think that it's actually a different story. There isn't one creation story, there are 2 creation stories. And this serpent is beguiling and cunning. And in some creation myths, there is a theme of this watery abyss where the sea monster brings about creation. Mesopotamia, creation myths. In the Jewish theological framework, they take the sea monster and they turn him into a snake. And the snake has this conversation with Eve and tells Eve that actually she's not going to be put to death, which was true. Because God says, if you eat this, you're going to die, but they don't die. So part of the cunning snake is that there's part truth in the conversation. And so Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. And for me, the story is not so much about concentrating on sin and, they're naked and the sowing of fig leaves. I often think of the sowing of fig leaves that the fashion industry is born in that verse. It's not about that. The people who are writing the story are talking about there is a process of separation that begins when the light is separated from the darkness, where the land is separated from the water, where woman and man are separated from each other, and then there is a disconnect within the people themselves. They're separated from their identities. Their children are separated, the tribes are separated, and we get into conflict. So there's this theme in Genesis that's running through, that there is explaining conflict and separation and dis-ease that is healed in the covenant between God and his people. So it's like the first opening of an opera. And if we get fixated on the sin and the fallen part, we don't really see the whole story. In the piece that Catherine read, which is kind of Chinese to most people, that piece in Romans is really difficult to unpack. But what Paul is saying, and again, we have lost the concept of being part of one race, the human race. In America, it's all about the individual and our individual salvation, our individual goals and vocation. Paul is writing for a Jewish audience that sees that Adam is the symbol of our link to one another that is flawed. And even when the law comes along, the Jewish law that's trying to keep us on the right path, even that reminds us of that we're broken. So the law isn't the solution either. That's basically what he's saying. We're one, and we share this flaw, but how do we get out of the flaw? And he sees in the person of Jesus that we are liberated from that cycle, and that in Jesus there is this redeemed humanity that becomes the example of being loving and just and full of God's Spirit to transform the world. Last Easter, you may remember, on the front cover of our bulletin, there was a picture of the resurrection, which is taken from the Kora Church in Istanbul. It's a medieval, beautiful fresco, and it's of the resurrection. And Jesus is pulling Adam and Eve out of the tombs. And so the medieval image, clearly they got it, was that it wasn't about that, I'm personally saved, me and Jesus. It's that the whole of the human family, the whole of who we are, broken and confused, is redeemed in the resurrection. And the consequence of this, the sin of Adam, that we are transformed and that death no longer has dominion over us because of the resurrection event. And I think that's what Paul is talking about. The solidarity of the human race. We're in this together. Sin and death is something we get from our common ancestry from Adam, and there's no personal blot or ink dripping onto the white blotting paper. That's not what Genesis and what Paul is talking about, and the medieval church was certainly not teaching that. So I want us to think about that in terms of our own journeys and our own thinking about what it means as we look at ourselves, and how texts like this can help us. A couple of years ago, I read this fascinating. It's an organizational theory based on the first two chapters of Genesis. And basically what the author is saying, depending on which chapter you believe is right, whether Basically, creation is good and fixes itself. We may go a little off target. The traditional meaning of sin is to miss the mark, like an archer missing the target. So we sometimes go off, but we figure out a way to get back on the path. And basically, creation is good. It's the first chapter of Genesis. We are made in the image of God, and that our creative instinct is part of that fingerprint of God. The second chapter is people who see the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And the church is like the little ark where a few people are saved from the chaos of the flood and the water and the destruction. And so creation is really not to be trusted. And we have to be very careful. And I believe that the Bible gives us both these stories and says to us, which one do you believe? Because depending on how you look through those spectacles will kind of color the way you are and the way you live, the way you tread upon this earth lightly or more frightened. So we're asked to think about that. Back to the theory that I read about this a couple of years ago. There are two sources, what we call the Yahwist, chapter 1, God is referred to as Yahweh, so it's known as the J source, like Jehovah, Yahweh. And the second chapter, God is referred to as Elohim, the E source. And so this writer is talking about an organization, any creative process, whether it's making widgets in a factory or designing some kind of non-profit mission, involves the creative process. It will be people whose natural inclination is to be a Yahwist. And that the belief that things go wrong but will fix themselves. So there's not a lot of attention paid to the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's. And we need the Elohists to come in and to keep us out of jail, make sure the books are right, and that we're following procedures. And the theory is that the organization begins to peak at the top of the bell curve, when we're doing what we're supposed to do. And then there is a crisis, and at the crisis, the procedures manual is written, and we all have to follow the rules. And what happens is the Yahwists get really bored, and they go off inventing and creating new things elsewhere. The second string Yahwists and the Elohists, who are dotting the T's and crossing the I's, run the organization into the ground. And the challenge, and we can think about, companies that we know where there isn't an infusion of creative energy. It's all about a kind of tight legal, this is the way we've always done it model. And so an infusion of creativity at the right point of the bell curve takes the organization into the next phase. And that's using, I think, a very helpful way, using the Genesis model that applies to churches, nonprofits, businesses, and maybe to think about that in your own work, where your organization, where your company is, and what do we bring. But the key thing is that one is not right or wrong. They need each other. That's the key thing. How do we find the balance, and how do we pay attention to what we have to contribute and what we need from others that we can thrive? So a lot to think about as we journey in Lent, and I hope that after today that you think about the Genesis story in particular differently. Because it is about our beginnings, and there's enormous wisdom to help us connect with who we are and where we are going. Amen.
Amen.